Aristotle's purpose in the Nicomachean Ethics is to determine the chief good of all human activity. This chief good, whatever it turns out to be, is what justifies all the other choices we make and the projects we undertake. While the immediate end pursued by medicine, for instance, is health, and the immediate end of the military science is victory, what justifies all these activities in an ultimate sense is some higher good, the pursuit of which constitutes a good human life. For this reason, Aristotle tells us that knowledge of this good is very important to our lives, and it provides a target at which to aim our actions, plans, and choices. This knowledge gives us an understanding of what it means to live our lives in a way that pursues the good. However, Aristotle has still not explained at this point precisely what this chief good is. In this lecture, we will continue our examination of Aristotle's search for the chief good by looking at chapters 3, 4, and 5 of Book 1. While we will still not find Aristotle's final answer to this question in those chapters, his conception of the good human life will begin to come into sharper focus. We will see some clear examples of what does not constitute the good life, and this will enable us to make some more positive claims about what features the chief good does actually possess. Furthermore, Aristotle gives this chief good a more concrete name. He calls it happiness. But of course, this just brings up even more questions because it is not yet clear exactly what happiness is. Is it something subjective or objective? Is it a psychological state like pleasure? Or maybe a course of action and a way of life? And how do we achieve it? Do we find happiness through pursuing wealth, pleasure, honor, or virtue? Or is it something else entirely? This lecture will examine the approach that Aristotle takes to these questions. In our search for the chief good, we should begin by looking for some baseline of agreement. If you asked any person from any walk of life, from any culture, from any profession, what it is that constitutes a good life, it is likely that that person would answer happiness. I mean, how strange would it be to encounter someone who didn't ultimately want to be happy? Aristotle recognizes this when he states the following. Most people, I should think, agree about what it is called, since both the masses and sophisticated people call it happiness, understanding being happy as equivalent to living well and acting well. Notice how Aristotle believes that both the masses as well as sophisticated people will agree on this point. Now, we might find the term masses off-putting, but I still think his basic idea here stands. You can ask the question of what makes a human life go well to almost anyone and expect, at least in the abstract, to get a similar answer. The minimum wage worker, middle manager, elementary school teacher, stay-at-home parent, politician, artist, and philosopher can all be expected to say that happiness is really what they want from life. Before continuing further, we need to consider the term happiness as it appears in Aristotle's text. The English word happiness is a translation of the ancient Greek word eudaimonia. And while this is the standardly used translation, some have found it lacking and proposed other alternatives besides happiness. For example, some have proposed that it should be translated instead as well-being or perhaps human flourishing. But why does this matter? Well, it matters because if we do not understand this point, we may find ourselves confused about what Aristotle really thinks is the highest good of human life. The main advantage of translating eudaimonia as happiness is that, as previously stated, happiness is the word that most modern people would use to describe what they want out of life. However, the disadvantage of this translation is that the word happiness has certain connotations for modern English speakers. As pointed out by John Cooper, who prefers the phrase human flourishing instead of happiness, We tend to think of happiness as a psychological state like pleasure, elation, or joy. And Aristotle does not deny that these things are parts of a happy life. But for him, true happiness or eudaimonia encompasses something much broader. Cooper points out that eudaimonia is the fulfillment of the natural capacities of the human species. Eudaimonia is really more of an achievement than a mere feeling. It is achieved by reaching a state of perfection in those powers, abilities, and pursuits that are distinctive of the human species. So, for example, imagine someone who experiences many positive feelings without perfecting their human nature. Someone may get intense enjoyment from binging Netflix, but this does not really qualify as a flourishing human life in Aristotle's sense. Furthermore, there are various claims that Aristotle makes later on that are not consistent with happiness being mere elation or pleasure. For example, Aristotle says that animals and children, despite being capable of pleasure, cannot be fully happy. He also says that we can only judge whether someone lived a good and happy life if we take into account their entire life from beginning to end. And in fact, it's even the case that things that happen after we die can have an effect on our happiness, even though at that point we will no longer have the capacity for pleasure, joy, elation, and other positive mental states. So, by happiness or eudaimonia, we will need to understand a more comprehensive good that involves pursuing the perfection of our nature and its distinctively human abilities. We now have a very general description of the chief good. The chief good is happiness or eudaimonia. This is the good that provides the final end goal for all of our choices, actions, and activities. While there is broad agreement that happiness is the highest good, Aristotle notes that unfortunately there is little agreement about what happiness actually is. He states that they disagree about substantive conceptions of happiness, the masses giving an account which differs from that of the philosophers. The common person and the philosopher might agree that happiness is our end, but each will have a very different conception and idea of what it actually means to be happy. The masses, whose time is largely spent working to meet the needs and demands of life, believe that happiness is found in those goods which are produced through practical action, something like pleasure or honor or wealth. According to this view, a happy life is one where we have time to enjoy pleasurable experiences, earn recognition for our efforts, or perhaps achieve financial success. And while Aristotle does not think that any of those things are bad, we are going to see that he does reject the idea that any of them can constitute our highest good. However, as we see from the next sentence, the disagreement actually runs even deeper than this. Aristotle tells us that often the same person can give different accounts. When he is ill, it is health. When he is poor, it is wealth. And when people are aware of their ignorance, they marvel at those who say it is some grand thing quite beyond them. When we are sick, we think all it will take to make us happy is to just regain our health. When we are poor, we think that winning the lottery would solve all of our problems. In this sense, we tend to be prisoners of the moment when we think about our happiness. This shows that there really is not just disagreement among different people about what it means to be happy. No, sometimes we even disagree with ourselves. Our conception of what it means to be happy can change with our mood and circumstance. This discussion might leave us feeling like the search for happiness is ultimately futile. If there are so many different opinions about happiness, then maybe there isn't some objective answer. Maybe what it means to be happy is really just purely subjective. Some people will be made happy with one sort of life, other people will be made happy with a different sort of life, and that is all there is to say about it. But if there is no objective answer to this question, then you might ask, why argue about it? We wouldn't argue about people's preferences for ice cream flavors, So why argue about what it means to be happy if happiness really is just subjective? Now, Aristotle rejects this subjectivist answer and approach, and he believes there are objective moral standards for living a flourishing human life. And while these standards are general enough that not everyone needs to live in precisely the same way, eudaimonia cannot be achieved through just any kind of life. However, we should not expect that the standards of happiness can be stated with mathematical precision. In chapter 3, Aristotle cautions us against demanding more accuracy from a discipline than that subject really permits. In mathematics, we can expect precision and exactness. But in ethics, a discipline which deals with the messy details of real life, that would really be an unreasonable expectation. For example, Aristotle says that some people have been ruined by wealth and others by courage. Now, both wealth and courage are good things, but depending on the particular circumstances of our life, they can also prove detrimental to us. So this means we cannot pronounce on the value of wealth or courage just in the abstract. So while there is an answer to the question of what it means to be happy and flourishing, it will not be an answer that specifies uniformly and precisely one strict way for everyone to live or exactly how we must act in every situation and circumstance. Next, Aristotle gives the following characterization of the typical philosophical approach to the question of happiness. Aristotle explains that certain thinkers used to believe that beyond these many good things, there is something else good in itself, which makes all these good things good. Aristotle uses the past tense here because he's referring to the view of his teacher Plato. And Aristotle discusses and criticizes Plato's view in chapter 6. But we will not be delving into those points here. For our purposes, we should notice that, speaking generally, this description also applies to Aristotle's own conception of the highest good. Everything that is good because it contributes to eudaimonia and human flourishing. Eudaimonia is something good in itself and not for any further end, which provides the ultimate reason for why we should engage in any other activity. So given that there are all these different opinions about happiness, how should we adjudicate between them? Aristotle tells us that he will look not at every possible opinion about happiness, but only at those that are the most prevalent and that seem to have something to be said for them. He will examine those conceptions of happiness that tend to be the most popular and that seem the most plausible. Now, while each of these opinions that he's going to look at does have some element of the truth, and some of these are better than others, ultimately Aristotle will find that each is lacking in some respect. We should begin by considering what kind of thing happiness is and what type of value it possesses. Here it may be helpful to consider a distinction that Aristotle draws in his discussion of friendship that comes later in Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics. There he distinguishes between three things that he says are worthy of our love: the good or virtuous, the pleasant, and the useful. Some things we love for their usefulness or for their utility, because they get us something else that we want. Others we love because they are pleasurable, and still others we love because of their moral goodness or inherent virtue. Importantly, Aristotle suggests that usefulness or utility could not be something that is worthy of love as an end. Whatever is merely useful for getting something else cannot be the sort of thing that we desire for its own sake. And if that is the case, then whatever is merely useful cannot be the chief good that we seek. It cannot be that which constitutes human happiness. We can better understand this point by considering Aristotle's discussion of the life of money-making. Aristotle tells us that the life of money making is a life people are, as it were, forced into. And wealth is clearly not the good we are seeking, since it is merely useful for getting something else. Given that money is necessary for doing almost anything else that we would like to do, it is easy to fall prey to the idea that money can surmount all obstacles to human happiness. Sure, you can't literally buy happiness, but can't you buy everything that you would need to be happy? But Aristotle rejects this idea, and not because money is bad. Rather, money is clearly good, and it is good precisely because it is useful for getting other good things. It is good because of its utility. Instead, Aristotle is not talking so much here about money itself as he is talking about the life of money making, a life where someone takes the accumulation of wealth to be their primary goal or highest purpose. But what is wrong with this kind of life? Remember that we are after the highest good, the good at which all other things aim. So, whatever that good is, it must be something desirable for its own sake, something it would make sense to want no matter your life circumstances. Yet, money clearly does not fit that criterion. Money definitely has value, but only insofar as it lets you purchase something else of value: food, shelter, entertainment, education, etc. Suppose you could get anything you wanted simply by snapping your fingers or asking a magic genie. At that point, money would cease to have any value at all for you. This is why Aristotle says that we are forced into money making. A teacher likely thinks that her work in education is valuable and serves the community well. But she wouldn't also think that it was important that she was paid for her labor if there was nothing that she needed to buy. So money is good, but it is good in a secondary sense that applies to all merely useful things. This is why the famous character Scrooge McDuck should seem comical and even strange. It is why we might even pity him despite his vast fortune. Mr. McDuck accumulated so much wealth that he couldn't find anything he wanted to spend it on, so much wealth that he made a habit of swimming through it like he was in a swimming pool. Apparently, he fails to understand that worshiping money is pointless. Money only has value to the extent that it is put to use. Mr. McDuck has mastered the art of financial success, but utterly failed in the art of living well. This shows that any life oriented towards something that is merely useful cannot be the truly happy human life. Eudaimonia is the most worthy of choice, but money, for example, is never more worthy of choice than the things that you buy with it. So, we would be better off, Aristotle says, if we focused on things that are valued for themselves. And we should notice that at the other two types of values that he mentions, pleasure and virtue, both meet this criteria. Suppose you go on vacation and you have a great time. You enjoy a wide variety of pleasurable experiences. Is that pleasure merely valuable because it is useful? Well, it doesn't seem so. You do not take that pleasure you experienced on vacation and try to use it to get something else. You simply enjoy the pleasure for its own sake, along with the good memories that you retain afterward. What about virtue or moral goodness? Suppose you do a morally good act, an act of courage or honesty or generosity. Doesn't the goodness of that act stand on its own? Moral virtue is good for its own sake. Its goodness does not derive from our ability to use it for some further end. Now, it is yet to be seen whether either of these, pleasure or virtue, fully captures the happy human life. However, each of these is at least a plausible candidate for happiness since its value is not merely a matter of utility. Each is valued for its own sake, and eudaimonia must also be something of that sort. Having established that happiness must be something that is valued for itself, Aristotle then outlines three especially prominent types of life which pursue a good of that sort: the life of pleasure, the life of politics, and the life of contemplation. We first need to clarify what exactly is involved with each of these lives, and here Aquinas' commentary can be helpful. The most straightforward is the life of pleasure. This life is fixated on the pleasures of the senses. Just like the life of money making sees accumulation of wealth as the highest good, so the person living the life of pleasure does not merely take pleasure in the good things of life, but orients all of her activity toward the pursuit of pleasure. This is likely someone living a very hedonistic lifestyle. The life of politics would be more complicated. At first glance, we probably think that what Aristotle means here is specifically the life of the politician. But Aristotle actually means something broader than this. Recall from the previous lecture that Aristotle understands politics to simply be the way that we live together in society. It is simply our public, shared way of life. So the life of politics is not merely the life of the politician, but the life of anyone engaged in a public occupation that contributes to our common life. Aquinas describes this kind of life as the public life which engages in practical reason about how to act. The life of politics would include the politician, of course, but it would also include teachers and lawyers and doctors and parents and business people and bricklayers. All of these use their reason to determine how to act in a specific domain that contributes to public life. Finally, there's the life of contemplation. This is a life that uses our ability for speculative reason in order to contemplate the truth. And it is the philosopher who exemplifies this kind of life to the highest degree by engaging in abstract reasoning about the purpose of life, or the beginning of the universe, or the nature of virtue. In Book 1, Aristotle does not say much about the life of contemplation. He tells us that he will discuss this type of life in what follows, but he does not address it again until Book 10. Aristotle does think contemplation plays an important role in human flourishing. However, at present, Aristotle's comments focus on the life of pleasure and the life of politics, and so our focus will be here as well. And I think this is fitting in that for most people, it is much more likely that one's life will look like one of these two options. It is a rare thing to have the time and space to contemplate deep philosophical questions for a prolonged period of one's life. But it is much more common to live a life oriented toward the pursuit of pleasure and enjoyment, or the various goods that come through active participation in one's occupation or role in the community. As such, we will address these two types of life in the next two sections of this video. Since pleasure is valued for its own sake, the life of pleasure has more in its favor than the life of money-making. It is undeniable that we are strongly inclined to equate happiness and pleasure. After all, pleasure colors everything we do in our lives. If someone asks you to identify the happiest experience in your life, it will likely be an experience of intense and long-lasting pleasure. If someone asks you to identify the worst experience in your life, it will likely be an experience of intense and long-lasting pain. For this reason, many moral philosophers have actually defined human well-being in terms of pleasure and pain. For instance, the 19th century British philosopher Jeremy Bentham famously remarked that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Furthermore, because pain and pleasure are so central to who we are and how we act, any moral system that attempts to question this, Bentham says, will deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. In Bentham's view, if we reject the claim that happiness is pleasure, then there really isn't any other firm foundation upon which ethics can stand. Despite our strong natural tendency to see the pleasurable life as the happy life, Aristotle makes quick work of rejecting the life of pleasure as the answer to the question that he is asking. He states that the masses appear quite slavish by rationally choosing a life fit only for cattle, but they are worthy of consideration because many of those in power feel the same as Sardanapalus. Aristotle recognizes the temptation to equate pleasure and happiness. He cites the desire that many have to be like Sardanapalus, the legendary depiction of the last king of Assyria. According to this legend, Sardanapalus was supposed to have lived a life of complete pleasure. Unfortunately, Sardanapalus was said to have died in an orgy, and that event is depicted here in a famous painting by Eugene Delacroix entitled The Death of Sardanapalus. For Sardanapalus, the pursuit of pleasure led to personal ruin, but that actually isn't why Aristotle thinks that the life of pleasure is inadequate. Aristotle believed this life was lacking even when it brought about no harm or ill consequences. The reason Aristotle deems the life of pleasure inadequate is because it is not a truly human life. It is a life fit only for cattle. A life devoted solely to the pursuit of pleasure might be a fine and happy life for a cow, but a human being is not a cow. And the happiness that Aristotle is concerned with is not just happiness for any being whatsoever, but specifically happiness for the human being. And if eudaimonia can only be achieved through striving to perfect our distinctively human capacities, then how could that be accomplished by living the life of an animal? From this, we can ascertain another important feature of eudaimonia. Human happiness must be constituted by something that is distinctive of the human species. The problem with pleasure is that other animals feel pleasure as well. Many other animals feel the enjoyment of bodily sensations. But human flourishing must involve something that is only possible for human beings. What it means for a human to flourish will not be the same as what it means for just any form of life to flourish. For Aristotle, our flourishing is uniquely tied to the nature of our species, and thus nothing will qualify as eudaimonia that is not specific to the human being. Now let's turn to the life of politics. Remember that Aristotle understood the life of politics to refer broadly to our public occupations, or as Aquinas explains it, to things pertaining to public life. The next question is, through our various forms of participation in public life, what goods are we seeking? Now, of course, one answer would be money. People work in various occupations for the sake of earning a living. But we can set this aside because we have already seen why money doesn't constitute human happiness. However, there are two other goods that we also commonly seek through public occupations: honor and virtue, and we will consider each of these in what follows. Aristotle tells us that honor is pretty much the end of political life. But what does he mean by honor? Honor just refers to any sort of recognition for the good things you do. It might take the form of praise, or maybe an official award, or even general popularity and admiration. For example, being recognized as valedictorian, being awarded Employee of the Month, enjoying the prestige that comes from securing a promotion at work, or even just receiving a compliment for one's appearance. Now again, Aristotle does not think that honor is bad. It is good to honor those who accomplish great things, and it's also good to see ourselves worthy of honor if we are the person who has accomplished something great. But honor itself cannot be equated with happiness. Aristotle tells us that honor is too shallow. First, This is because honor appears to depend more on those who honor than on the person honored. But we surmise the good to be something of one's own that cannot be taken away easily. What does Aristotle mean here? His point can be illustrated by thinking of something like the Academy Awards. These awards are meant to honor excellence in acting and filmmaking. Suppose an actress does an exemplary job of portraying her character. By some objective measure, let's say she does better than everyone else she is competing against, but she fails to win the award. Maybe the film and her performance were not understood properly, maybe it was ahead of its time, maybe there was even corruption in the selection committee. Whatever the reason, just imagine that she was the best, but she did not win. Now, what should we think about her performance in this case? Does the fact that she did not win make her performance any worse? Well, no, it doesn't seem to. Her performance stands as it is whether she wins or not. The decision of the selection committee has no bearing upon the inherent quality and excellence of the work that she did. At its most basic level, the award just signifies the judgment of the people who are giving the award. Now, this is not to say that their judgment is invalid or worthless. Given their expertise in this area, the hope is that their judgment will reflect the real merit of the performances. However, at the end of the day, winning the award requires winning the favor of the judges, and anyone, even an expert, can make a mistake. And this is the crucial point. It is one thing to strive to perform your best and then hope that if your effort produces something great, it will be appropriately recognized. However, it is another thing entirely to act merely for the sake of the approval and recognition of others, and to think that your very happiness depends upon it. This puts your happiness and flourishing at the mercy of other people and makes you a people pleaser who constantly chases after something that you cannot control, namely the approval and praise of others. But this is no way to live your life. By living this way, you make yourself a slave to others' opinions. You make your happiness dependent upon something completely outside of your control. We can control the effort we put forth in our pursuit of excellent accomplishments, but we are not in control of what other people think. Thus, Aristotle finds that honor is simply too shallow to constitute real happiness. This shows that whatever eudaimonia is, it must be something that is, at least to a significant extent, within our control. However, it should also be said that even Aristotle does not believe that happiness is completely within our control. There are some things that can happen for which we are not responsible that can undermine our happiness and our ability to achieve eudaimonia. And we will see Aristotle discuss this point very shortly. There is also a second reason why happiness is not merely the pursuit of honor. Aristotle tells us that, again, they seem to pursue honor in order to convince themselves of their goodness. At least they seek to be honored by people with practical wisdom, among those who are familiar with them and for their virtue. So it is clear that to these people at least, virtue is superior. So ask yourself, why do people want to be honored? Or maybe, why should people want to be honored? Should we accept honor from just anyone? Imagine that someone praised your work, but that person was a morally corrupt and vicious individual with very questionable judgment. Is this an honor you would be proud to receive? Probably not. But why not? If honor really were the highest good, if honor really were all that mattered, then why would the source of that honor be important? Well, presumably the reason we should seek honor is because it is a sign of our accomplishment, excellence, and virtue. As Aristotle puts it, we do so to convince ourselves of our own goodness. But if someone who is morally vicious and uninformed honors you, then you might actually draw the opposite conclusion. You might reasonably think that this is a sign that you have done something wrong and not a sign that you have accomplished something great. As a result, you might be anxious to reject the recognition that you received from that person. What this shows is that what matters is not just honor itself. What really matters is the virtue or accomplishment that the honor is meant to recognize. But if so, then honor isn't really what we are seeking, even if it does feel good to receive honors. That is because virtue is actually more important than honor. And if virtue and accomplishment are more important than honor, then virtue and accomplishment are more worthy of choice. But we've already seen that there's not supposed to be anything that is more worthy of choice than happiness. Therefore, from this it follows that happiness cannot consist primarily in the pursuit of honor. So maybe the real purpose of our engagement in public life is not praise and honor itself, although these things are nice, but some excellent accomplishment that is worthy of praise and worthy of being celebrated. What we are seeking is not honor as much as the virtues of character which make us worthy of receiving that honor. As Aristotle puts it, perhaps virtue rather than honor is actually the end of the political life. Furthermore, this seems like a strong candidate for the good of eudaimonia. As we will see, virtue plays a central and crucial role in Aristotle's account of what it means to be happy. Later in Book 2, he identifies the inculcation of virtue as the endeavor through which we perfect our human nature. Yet despite the undeniable importance of virtue for living a good life, Aristotle argues that even virtue seems to be lacking something. He explains that this is because one can possess virtue even when one is asleep or inactive throughout one's life, and also when one is suffering terribly or experiencing the greatest misfortunes. And no one would call a person living this kind of life happy unless he were closely defending a thesis. Now, I confess that some of Aristotle's points here do seem strange to me. He wants to say that we can imagine people who are virtuous but do not lead flourishing lives because ultimately they're not doing anything. They're not putting their virtue to good use. Yet, Aristotle's example of the sleeping person strikes me as odd. Sure, the courageous person does not exercise their courage while they are asleep, but presumably that person will wake up and then have plenty of opportunities to act courageously. The case of someone who is inactive in their whole life seems strange for a different reason. How could such a person be considered courageous or honest or generous in the first place? Don't you have to act courageously to be a courageous person? Don't you have to commit acts of generosity to be a generous person? It doesn't actually seem that you can develop virtue if you really are completely inactive. Yet, putting this aside, I think Aristotle's example of someone who is suffering terribly or experiencing the greatest misfortunes touches on something important about how we evaluate a person's life. Imagine that someone suffers from a debilitating illness for a great portion of their life. Suppose also that this person faces their plight with patience, courage, cheerfulness, and continues to act with kindness toward other people. This would clearly be a person with many virtues, and in fact, the difficulty of their circumstances makes those virtuous qualities shine even more brightly. But would we say that this kind of life is a happy life, a flourishing life? Certainly, this individual is flourishing in certain respects, but no one would likely point to this person as someone who is an exemplar of human happiness. Unless, of course, this person was just arguing for the sake of arguing. And that is exactly what Aristotle means when he references someone who is closely defending a thesis. Aquinas provides another example of this in his commentary. He notes that a person might have the habit of virtue, but lack the opportunity to exercise it, and consequently, never perform a single act of that virtue in their entire life. For example, Aquinas mentions the virtue of magnificence. This is the virtue that is concerned with giving away large amounts of money to charity. Now, suppose there is a kind, caring person with a generous heart who, were she in a position to do so, would take great joy in giving to charities that help feed the poor and fight disease. However, suppose also that this person is poverty stricken. She lacks the resources to give large amounts to charity. In that case, through no fault of her own, she would be prevented from exercising the virtue of magnificence. And the broader point here is this: we are going to see that in Aristotle's view, virtue is essential for eudaimonia. However, it cannot be sufficient for eudaimonia because we do not control certain aspects of human flourishing. Certain virtues require favorable circumstances of life. In addition, even if we do perfect some virtues, we can still suffer horrible misfortunes that fill our lives with suffering. Once again, while Aristotle believes that human flourishing should largely be within our control, that does not mean that human flourishing will be entirely within our control. Some amount of good fortune will be required. For that reason, not even moral virtue can guarantee complete human flourishing. Where does all of this leave us? Well, we know that the chief good is eudaimonia, or happiness, or human flourishing. This is the end at which all human activity aims. And while we still do not have a complete account of what human flourishing is, we are beginning to get a better sense of it. We know that it must be the final end of all action. It must be something that is more important and worthy of choice than any other end. It has to be something that is distinctive of the human species, and that it must be something that is, at least to a significant extent, within our control. In the next lecture, we will finally see Aristotle's answer to the question of what constitutes human happiness, and have a chance to evaluate how it relates to these criteria that he has set forth thus far.